Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Putting the Systems Back in Systems Engineering. My name is Katie, I'm Communications Manager here at Vitech, and I will be your host during today's webinar presented by Zane Scott. We're taking a look at the registrations we have in today, and I'm glad to see we have attendees from a wide variety of backgrounds, including longtime systems engineering leaders to brand new practitioners. Zane Scott is our Vice President of Professional Services and Training Organization here at Vitech. For the past 25 years, he has built a skill set which enables him to provide insight and guidance to individuals and companies as they improve organizational processes and methodologies across their organizations. He's also taught systems engineering methodology in the practical process context in a variety of settings. Zane has a BA in economics from Virginia Tech and a JD from the University of Tennessee Law School. He has completed his postgraduate work in business administration and educational counseling. Zane is a member of the American Society of Training and Development and the International Association of Hostage Negotiators. Before Zane gets started, I do have a few housekeeping items. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar today, so please send your questions in as soon as you think of them through the question tab on the webinar control panel. Zane will answer as many questions as he can today, but if we don't get to your question, we will reach out to you after the webinar. Our webinar is being recorded today, so if you experience connection problems during the live presentation, a recording will be available within about 24 hours of our live version. The recording will be published to Vitech's webinar archive located on our website. I will send the link out in the chat window. So now I will turn the presentation over to Zane. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank everybody for coming out and giving a little bit of your time here. I trust it'll be worth your while as you look back at the end of the webinar. It's interesting, as we put out the publicity for this webinar, I got a note from a friend of mine who got the advertisement, and he said, putting the systems back in systems engineering, is the system lost? Are systems lost? And he's probably right. Probably a little better but longer and unwieldier title for this would be putting the systems thinking back in systems engineering. So we're going to be talking about systems thinking today and its role in systems engineering. Just as we wouldn't go on a journey without a map, we probably shouldn't go through the webinar without a map of where we're going with this. So we're going to begin by talking about where are we. We're going to answer my buddy's question. Do systems get lost? Does systems thinking get lost? And what's the state of where we are? Then we'll talk a little bit about how we got here. What arises that causes us to, from time to time and to a greater or lesser extent, lose our grip on systems thinking. And finally, we're going to close up with how do we move forward? How do we get from where we are to where we need to be? This is a very interesting topic, I think. I hope you'll agree with me when we're done, and a topic that I've been looking at pretty extensively over the last couple of years. So join me on this journey and let's have a good time and hopefully learn something in the process. Where are we now? Well, in our current state, we are taught, both in terms of our overall mindset and paradigm and in terms of our education, to engage in analytical problem solving. And we're going to talk at length about what analytical problem solving is, but basically it can be understood as trying to understand any whole, any system, by understanding the parts. So if we want to understand how a system works, then we break it down into its constituent parts. I've said in presentations before that I have a brother who is a true child of the Enlightenment and the analytical problem-solving method. When we were growing up, he took everything apart. We needed to race home from school to protect our bicycles, lest we come home and find an array of bicycle parts on the back porch as he made an effort to understand his bicycle and ours, and in the process to mix the parts. But that's how we're taught. we not only break down the systems themselves in order to understand them from a physical viewpoint, but we tend to treat problems in the same way. So analytical problem solving would call for us to break the problems down in order to understand the entire problem. We'll take an example, and since this is is going to be a bad example, I cast around a little bit to find an example where if I'm going to call this baby ugly, it's hopefully not going to be the baby of anybody involved. So I doubt that we have anybody involved in setting Maoist policy in China back in the time of the Great Leap Forward. But this is a good illustration of exactly what I'm talking about. China had what turned out to be a series of great leaps forward and 5-year plans, etc. In the course of taking the great leap forward, one of the biggest problems they faced was the problem of hunger. They simply did not have enough food to go around to feed the population. So they began to engage in exactly what we're talking about, analytical problem solving. They were very astute students of the Western methods of solving problems and the scientific methods, and prided themselves, in fact, on approaching problems in that way. So they looked at the hunger problem and said, look, it's our low harvest yields, the insufficient amounts of grain, for example, that we're getting that's causing the hunger problem. So what's causing the low yields? Well, they determined that sparrows, and by the way, rats and some other pests, were eating a part of their harvest, and that was causing the ultimate yield to the consumer to be lower than it should be. So the solution became obvious. If sparrows eat grain and that causes a low harvest yield, then the answer is obviously we need to get rid of sparrows. So what they did was institute a bounty program, and they offered financial incentives for members of the Chinese population to go out and bring in dead sparrows. There were bounty programs on some of the other pests as well. But the Chinese people went to work, and they were very, very effective in basically wiping out the sparrow population. So there were essentially no significant amounts of grain eaten by sparrows once this bonus problem took effect. Problem solved, right? Well, not so fast. They began to notice that they had another problem, and they didn't necessarily connect this problem with the food problem because it seemed to be unrelated. But the real genesis of the problem was that the sparrows not only ate grain, but they also ate insects. So once you got the sparrow population down to minimal levels, then the insect population took off, and they were essentially cursed with a plague of insects. So now you have another problem in that a scarcity of sparrows equals a plethora of insects, and they had to do something. So they decided that they needed to get rid of the insects. That was what was causing the problem. So they began to engage in spraying programs and distributing insecticides and doing all kinds of things to decrease the insect population. Once again, they were very successful, and they were not plagued by the hordes of flying and crawling and swimming insects. They were able to get the insect population under control and down to minimums. Problem solved, right? Now we don't have sparrows eating the grain, and we don't have insects plaguing us. Once again, not so fast. Because this brought on another problem. Bees are insects, so the efforts at eradicating insects were equally effective with bees. And for bees, we could also read in other pollinators, but bees were the principal pollinators of their crops. So if you have no bees, you have no pollination. If you have no pollination, then the crop doesn't bear fruit. And guess what? We're back at the original place that we started with food shortages. This time because the pollinators have been wiped out, and you're not able for them to pollinate the crops, so they're not able to produce the food, which means that we have a food shortage. So by solving in a way of linear cause and effect, by solving three problems, the problem of sparrows eating the grain, the problem of infestations, we created the no pollinators, and therefore we have the third problem, which is the original problem back, that of a food shortage. So even today in China, as they try to figure out ways to reestablish the pollinator populations, they're facing the necessity of actually using humans to do pollination. So especially in the fruit crops area, there are lots of humans who are actually out there physically doing pollination in the place of the natural pollinators that were killed off by their problem-solving techniques. So what happened here? How did we come full circle and get right back to the original problem? Well, we did that essentially by using the linear cause and effect analysis and by dissecting the problem. So instead of looking at the problem systemically from the very beginning and recognizing what the feedback loops were and recognizing what the context system was and recognizing some of the things that we'll talk about with systems engineering, they simply solved the problem right before them, the piece of the problem right before them, and they dissected the overall system and its problems into individual problems and used the linear cause and effect method for dealing with those. Ultimately, of course, that led them to the necessity of human pollinators, which is kind of in a worse situation than where they started. And the result of all of this was that with the dissected problems and the use of Cartesian deconstruction, we'll talk about that a little bit, they were plunged back into the full circle, back into the original problem that they had. Of course, that would never happen with us, right? Wrong. It happens with us every day. How does it manifest for us? It manifests for us because we have dissected problems. We deconstruct problems. We engage in reductionism. We reduce the problem to divide it up into separate problems, and we don't consider the overall systems involved. I could go on and on with examples of how this manifests in particular problem-solving efforts. It goes even deeper than that because this is a paradigm with us. It's a way of thinking. And we'll talk about where that way of thinking came from, but we have that way of thinking, so not only do we dissect our problems, we divide our disciplines. We value specialists over generalists. So who's paid more in our medical community, the neonatal cardiologist or the family practitioner? Of course, it's the neonatal cardiologist. The narrow specialties, these are thought to be the peak of the professions, be that engineering or the medical professions or whatever. We divide the disciplines. We hear things, very interesting things, as we talk to customers and potential clients. They tell us things like, our systems engineering is handled by the requirements engineers. Well, that's theoretically possible if the requirements engineers actually function as systems engineers. But most often, the requirements engineers function as requirements engineers. And in that case, they're not handling systems engineering because they're handling a segment, a piece, of an important piece, but a piece of systems engineering. The other thing that we get are statements like, we don't do behavior. We allocate requirements directly to components. In other words, we skip a domain in the systems engineering process. We completely jump over the logical architecture. When we hear that statement, we know that the person giving us the statement really doesn't have a very complete understanding of systems engineering, what it is or how it's done. Because the nasty surprise in systems engineering is that the four domain description of it, the systems thinking part of it, are descriptive. Those are not arbitrary categories. And so when you don't do behavior, what you do is you allow behavior to happen. It's not possible to skip the logical architecture. It is possible to just let the logical architecture kind of form on its own, and then you become the beneficiary or the victim of it, but you haven't done it intentionally. And if there's one theme of this talk, it ought to be that we ought to be doing systems engineering intentionally, and that we can't do that without systems thinking. So let's look at how we got here. Where does this come from? Well, if you look into the Middle Ages, you find a picture of the universe, and particularly the world, the Earth, which they felt like was the center of the universe, is pictured as organic, interrelated. It all hooks together. You can't poke one piece of it without poking the others. The disciplines that they in medieval times would have called the sciences would include mathematics and some of the sciences that we would recognize today, but it would also include philosophy, logic. It would include theology. And this was because they saw the universe as an integrated whole. Then along comes some folks, and there's a whole procession, and I've just pulled up some of the giants, some of the big players in it to talk about, and not necessarily in chronological order. But Johannes Kepler was a leader in saying, look, the rotation of the planets can be explained in terms of laws. These operate in terms of principles that control the physical operation. And he really began a description of what Copernicus had started with his heliocentric universe view. Kepler begins to describe that and begins to describe the laws that at first describe the motion of the planets and then arguably control the motion of the planets. Newton takes that work a step forward, and Newton gets into the whole idea of the laws of motion, the laws of physics, and in particular he begins to describe the operation of those laws in mathematical terms. And so you have Newton's calculus, which of course is an effort to describe change, and he develops mathematics far beyond what it had ever been developed before, although you have Leibniz and some other folks developing a calculus as well at the same time. William Harvey makes an interesting advance in this kind of mechanistic view of the universe because he starts to see the human body as a mechanical system. It's Harvey who discovers the interconnectedness of the circulatory system and begins to describe the flow of blood and the exchange of oxygen and the pumping action of the heart and the pressures in in the blood vessels, and he sets us off on a hunt that begins to describe the human body as a mechanical system. So that indicates to others who are philosophers in that time period that, hey, maybe all of creation functions in a mechanistic way by laws that are set up, and some of them attribute those laws to an intentional creator, others attribute the laws to simply being nature's laws. But wherever they come from, those rules and principles mechanically control the operation of the universe. Now, Descartes is the one who really kind of synthesizes a lot of this stuff and says, look, you can take a system that's complex and you can understand it by taking it apart. If you want to understand the operation of the human body, then you need to understand it as the sum of the operation of the digestive system and the circulatory system and the structural system. So Descartes really gets the reductionist or deconstructionist idea going forward, and he's the author of the essence of our analytic method. All of this gains momentum throughout the Enlightenment and forms really the paradigm under which we were all educated and which we all, to one extent or another, operate. Now, this leads to some rough riding later, because you get into some interesting arguments when you get to first to light. This kind of gave Newton some pause, and we had to have a little bending over backwards and a little engaging in some fictions in order to explain light in this system. But when you got to electromagnetism, there were real problems. In the area of medicine, you got into the problems when you got to mind-body problems. And things begin to kind of fray at the edges. Now that we've been through Einstein and Bohm and some of those people, the area of quantum theory and quantum mechanics are beginning to sort of fray the edges of this analytical paradigm of a mechanistic universe. So there are folks in the world like Fritjof Capra who are arguing that science is now circling back to its roots, and we know a little bit more about the factual structure of what's going on, but we're coming back to the integrated whole and the complex systems and the systems understanding. So what in the world does this have to do with us? Well, it has to do with us because it shapes our paradigm. We almost can't think in a different way than the analytical way, than the Enlightenment deconstructionist way, unless we stop and intentionally say, I want to think in a different way. We have to understand that paradigm and have to want, for some reason, for one reason or another, to move beyond it, because it so shapes our frame of mind and our paradigm of dealing with the world. So it positions us to deconstruct problems, deconstruct disciplines, to promote a system of specialization, to think in terms of parts rather than wholes, and it kind of encourages us to lose our grip on the systems view. So when I say that we're losing systems view or systems thinking, our grip is being loosened by our status as children of the Enlightenment. So how do we move forward? From a practical standpoint, what exactly is it that we can do to move forward? How can we get out of the box? Well, I'm going to suggest today that there are three basic ways to get out of the box. These are not the only things. We might posit others, but I think these are three very important things that we need to do to either get out of the box or understand the box we're in and strategize about how we might cope with that. The first way we move forward is to take the systems view, and we'll talk about what that means. But we need to adopt a systems view, and we need to do that in a way that becomes instructive. We need to pay attention to the lessons of our sister disciplines. Now, we're not the only systems discipline in the world. Systems engineering doesn't stand alone in its consideration of system. There are a number of others, so we need to be cognizant of the others and lessons that they learn, and we need to do some good hard thinking about how they impact the way that we operate. And then thirdly, I'm going to suggest that we manifest our models, that we make our models visible, and we'll talk about each of these in turn here. So let's look at taking a systems view. What do we need to do to take a systems view? The first thing we need to do is we need to recognize that there are three systems. Anytime we're trying to solve a problem, we're dealing with three systems. Now, I say this with all due apologies to James Martin, and there's a very interesting article out there that you can get. It's available in PDF form that was authored by James Martin. And he uses a metaphor based on the Japanese movie The Seven Samurai. And he calls it the Seven Samurai of Systems Engineering. So if you go out there and Google that, you'll find a worthwhile article. And you'll find that what I advocate is three systems, he sees as seven different systems. And you'll see the parallels and understand it together. But for simplicity's sake, let's talk about the three systems. The first system is the context of the problem. This is where the problem lives and where our solution will live. If we don't understand the context, then we're asking for problems with unintended consequences. That's the problem that the Chinese faced. Okay, so we eradicate sparrows, and sparrows no longer eat grain. We have more grain for people to eat, and we contribute to solving the problem of hunger. All that's very sound, except that it ignores the context system in which the sparrows eat grain problem lives, because there's a broader context and there are broader implications. So when we fail to understand the context system, then we're setting ourselves up for issues that have to do with unintended consequences. The second system is the system of interest. That's our solution to the problem. What systemic answer are we going to have for the problem at hand? We almost never fail to consider this. We might not do it justice. Sometimes we might have problems in the way we consider it, but almost no good engineer would actually ignore the problem that they're trying to solve. However, there's one little caution here. You do need to understand the problem that you solve. Albert Einstein once said, if I had an hour to consider how I was going to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. It's very important to solve the problem, and you have to understand it to solve it. Russell Ackoff said we go wrong more often by getting the right answer to the wrong problem than we ever go wrong by getting the wrong answer to the right problem. So that's all a part of understanding the system of interest, the problem at hand, and the system that we're going to use to solve it. The one that gets ignored the most is the system we use to design the answer, the system we use to solve the problem. Sometimes a poorly designed problem-solving system leads us to poor quality answers to the problem that we're attempting to solve. Poorly designed solutions come out of a poorly designed system to produce the solutions. So we need to be cognizant of the three systems in order to take the systems view. We need the broad context system. We need to understand the system that we're looking at, the solution that we're designing, and then we need to understand what the system is that we are using to solve the problem. We need to understand how those fit together, how they relate. The system that you use to solve one type of problem might not be particularly well designed to solve another problem. So we need to understand how they fit together. Anytime we're considering systems, relationships are the key, and this is no exception. So we need to understand how these three systems relate to each other. And finally, in taking the systems view, we need to honor the domains. It's very, very tempting to jump the logical architecture, to skip the behavior. I don't need that behavior stuff. We get people who sign up for the classes and they'll say, I'd like to reduce the time in class, so how about if you skip all that behavior? We don't do functional analysis. Well, you can't skip the logical architecture, as I said earlier, because it's really the logical architecture that meets the requirements. Your physical architecture doesn't meet the requirements, except in the sense that it performs the logical architecture. So if you make physical architecture choices without thinking about the logical architecture, you're producing a logical architecture that may or may not actually meet the requirements. So we need to honor the fact that the four domains are there: requirements, behavior, physical architecture or implementation structure, and validation and verification. We need to think about all four. If we do those three things, we'll be well on our way to taking the systems view, which is the first step. The second step is that we need to pay attention to the lessons that are being learned in our sister domains, our sister disciplines. So systems thinking, systems theory, systems science, systems approaches in biology, ecology, economics, public policy, medicine, all of these are adopting a systems approach to the problems, issues, and questions in their disciplines. All of them are learning things about observing the system. And what you'll be amazed at as you look into them is their similarity. We're going to hear a little bit from Fritjof Capra in a second. And he became famous by writing a book in the 1970s called The Tao, and Tao of course means way, the Tao of physics. And what he did there was he called to the surface the similarities that he was noticing between physics at a high level and the practice of Eastern spirituality. So he began to call those similarities to light, and has written a number of books since, and has since moved from being a physicist to being an ecobiologist, and seeing the commonality between the disciplines, the scientific disciplines. The commonality he sees is the systems view, the universal applicability of the principles of systems and systems analysis to the problem-solving method in general. Now, most of our sister domains are characterized by an observe, understand, and adapt approach. So if you're looking at ecobiology, for instance, an ecobiologist says, here's a system, here's a wet marsh, here's this biological system or that biological system. We need to understand how it works, and then we need to adapt to how we are able to interface with it. So we adapt our own behaviors to respect those systems and to understand the consequences if we were to influence the system in some way. Systems engineering, I think, is unique in that what we bring to the table with the systems disciplines is the interventional tools and mindset of engineering. Engineers, by their very essence, change things. They intervene. They do so in a way that solves problems. So you don't just look at a system, understand it, and adapt to it. You look at a system with an idea of intervention, helpful intervention in mind. So I think that we can learn from the observe, understand, and adapt, and at the same time we can bring our tools and methods of intervention to the table to make it possible to do things in our adaptation to the systems that they're looking at that they don't really have the tools to see as even possible. Let's look at what something that Capra says, and as I'm going to read this because as I read it I want you to think about how pretty much dead on this is in terms of something that we would say about systems engineering. According to the systems view, the essential properties of a system are properties of the whole, which none of the parts have. They arise from the interactions and relationships among the parts. These properties are destroyed when the system is dissected, either physically or theoretically, into isolated elements. Although we can discern individual parts in any system, these parts are not isolated, and the nature of the whole is always different from the mere sum of its parts. And when you look at that statement by a physicist turned ecobiologist, what do you see? Well, you see the two elements of a definition of systems right out of systems engineering. If you go to the NCOSE definition, the two elements you find are that it's a construct of individual parts. It's a collection or a construct. Capra has that here. He says that interactions and relationships between separate parts. So he has that. The second thing that you find in the NCOSE definition, or any other really systems engineering definition of a system, is that the system itself has properties which go beyond that of any of the individual parts, or even an aggregation of the individual parts. It has properties that rest on those interactions and relationships. And if you take it apart, those properties disappear. The third and final step in what I'm suggesting as our way to taking a systems view is that we need to manifest our models. Now, somebody might say, and perhaps more than one of you all, and certainly people in our profession would say, hold on there. I don't do that MBSE stuff. You know, I don't practice model-based systems engineering. Well, here's a news flash. Not only does every systems engineer practice model-based systems engineering, but it's not possible to do engineering. In fact, it's not possible to do any kind of problem solving without using models. The only issue, the issue that sets model-based systems engineering apart is that in model-based systems engineering, we manifest the model. Where is the model? You know, we've got three folks here all thinking of an apple, a red apple, a green apple, and a laptop. We have models that we deal with. If we're among those people who say, I don't use models, what we're saying is, I use models, but I keep them to myself. That means that we can't have them out where we can work on them, where we can truly collaborate. Think of all of the sitcoms that you've seen where the setup for the sitcom is that one character in the drama understands the situation to be something different than another character understands it to be. And so we as the audience have the gift of knowing what each person thinks is going on. So we watch them blunder around through the situation with two different ideas of what's going on. If we don't manifest our models, then we can't effectively talk about the system, because we're talking about two different systems, two different solutions, two different problems. So if we're going to engage in systems thinking, we need to manifest the problems, manifest the models rather. And that means getting them out where everybody can see them. That means getting the whole model out there. That doesn't mean getting this piece of it and that piece of it and aggregating them together, because then we're in the deconstruction problem. So we need to have the whole model out there in a format where we can collaborate, where we can talk, where we can ask questions, pull and tug, and influence the design of the solution and the understanding of the problem. So those are the three steps that I would posit are key to engaging in systems thinking and putting true systems thinking back into systems engineering. Well, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to take those steps? Well, the first thing is that I think there's economic opportunity here. There's gold in them there hills, so to speak. Why? Because when we do that, when we think in systems ways, we begin to recognize that there's a broader application for systems engineering than we perhaps give it at this point in our development. Systems engineering as a named discipline grows up in the mil-aerospace. You use systems engineering to design planes and ships and trains and tanks and guns and weapons, and then along come the software folks and says, you know, systems engineering can properly be used to design software that operates these things, and we can break systems into subsystems, et cetera, et cetera. But it's more broadly applicable than that. There's more opportunity than that. And the key to being able to make the translation is that we have to think at the high level. We have to get up to this level of systems thinking and ask ourselves not where does this technical tool fit, where does this technical method fit in terms of solving a problem, but where does this approach fit? And the approach fits anywhere you can find systems. And if you ask the question, where can we find systems, guess what the answer to that is? Everywhere. And certainly everywhere there's a problem. So, could systems engineers be helpful in solving the problem of the VA in meeting its service obligations? You bet. You bet. Is there opportunity to use systems engineering to design educational delivery systems? Yeah, you bet. Why? Because those are systems, and because these principles, these techniques, these methods apply anywhere there are systems. So there's a broad economic opportunity. But in order to take advantage of that, we have to change the way that we think. We have to put the systems back in systems engineering. The second reason is that we really need to put systems engineering into its proper place. We need to see that systems engineering is actually at the top of the pyramid, putting everything together. I would never advocate that we need to get rid of specialists and their specialized knowledge. We certainly don't need to do that, because studying narrow subjects allows us to take deeper dives and develop deeper understandings of these narrow slices. But the narrow slices need to be put together into pictures of problems and pictures of solutions. And so that understanding has to be stitched together by someone. And the person who stitches that together is the systems engineer. Systems engineering is not a librarian over on the side cataloging the documents. The systems engineer is the lead professional who webs it all together, who stitches it into its form, and who puts it forward as a real solution to real problems. And really, actually, at the base of it all, ultimately what we can do, and the reason we ought to do this, is because once we understand it in this way, we can provide real service to clients that have real problems. We can really solve the problem. We won't give them a partial solution to a problem. We won't give them a solution that will cause worse problems than they already had. We won't become the poster children for the cure is worse than the disease. We'll actually do real service to clients who have real problems. Now, some resources, if you haven't detected it, I get pretty excited about this stuff because I think it really is the land of opportunity for us. But if you're beginning to get some of that excitement and you want more, I want to recommend some resources here. The first one is Fritjof Capra and Pierre Louisi's new book, just came out I think in March. It's called The Systems View of Life, A Unifying Vision. Capra calls it the culmination of a number of books. He's written or participated in a whole bunch of books. This one draws them together. It's well worth the read. I'm on the second trip through it since March. This book would be worthwhile just for the history of science and the history of scientific thought that's contained in it. Fascinating book, but an important book, I think. The second book is an older book. It's originally from the 1990s. It's been updated. It's out in a relatively new edition in the last couple of years. It's called The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge. Peter Senge's an MIT professor who worked with the systems science folks at MIT, and it's a book that spawned a whole bunch of other work in the areas of management and problem solving and thinking about problems. I heartily recommend it if you haven't already read it. There are a couple of good resource books that have been spawned from it that Senge and his team did. One is called The Fifth Discipline Field Book, and the other is called The Dance of Change. All of those are excellent resources, but The Fifth Discipline is the place that it came from. Then if you want to take a different view, if you want to go in a different direction, if you want to test my assertion that these principles are broadly applicable, I recommend the book Idealized Design by Akoff and Magnuson and Addison. Very, very interesting book. Akoff is a systems thinker. He was a professor at the Wharton School and a couple of other universities. Very interesting guy. Usually when I teach, I recommend that you go on YouTube and you watch some Russell Akoff. Be ready for his language. It's not always dressed up for Sunday dinner, but there are a lot of YouTube segments of talks and classes by Akoff out there. I went out and taught a class in Illinois and suggested it, and two of the guys came in the second day of the class and said, "During your hide, I was up all night watching Russell Akoff." They kind of chained their way through the offerings on the internet and were fascinated by him. I think you would be too, and I think that his stuff is good, but the idealized design kind of encapsulates his thought. Finally, I want to recommend a film called Mind Walk. Now, this is a film, I think, from the early 1990s. Burnt Capra is the brother of Fritjof Capra. He's a movie producer. And he made a movie drawn from one of Fritjof's books, and it's called Mind Walk. It stars Sam Waterston as a U.S. Senator who has just had a failed campaign for the presidency, who contacts a friend of his who is a poet and a speechwriter and wants to talk to him about whether or not he should rerun for his Senate seat, and et cetera. And the guy says, well, come over here and meet with me. He's vacationing, I think, on an island in the English Channel off of the coast of France. And so Waterston goes over and meets his buddy, and they go for a walk on the island and into a cathedral monastery that's there on the island, and start touring this old building and run into Liv Ullmann, who plays a physicist. And the film is basically an hour and 48-minute conversation on systems thinking, the systems viewpoint. Very, very interesting. If, however, you need Clint Eastwood to show up at some point and you'll make my day, you're not going to find that kind of stuff in this movie. So it's not for the faint of heart. You need to be ready to pay attention and in a mood to think. But if you are and you're interested in this subject, this is a fascinating film. Well, having said those things, I really appreciate your time and attention. I would welcome a dialogue with anybody and everybody, and I think we're going to have some time left here for questions and answers and dialogue. So if you have questions, indicate that, and we can engage in some discussion here. But thank you for attending, and I hope it's meant something.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zane. We do have a few questions, and thank you so much to all of our participants. If you have any more questions as you come in, we will be taking a couple more. If you want, you can submit those again through your webinar control panel. If you do need to leave now, if you need to step out, please do take the webinar survey on your way out. We would love to hear from you. Our first question we've got is from Ray, and he asks, how would you talk about systems engineering to a potential customer in a non-traditional market?
Well, Ray, I think the first thing that I would say is that I would not talk about systems engineering, at least not at the outset, to somebody in the non-traditional market. I would talk about the base concepts, systems thinking, the necessity for analyzing complex problems from a systems viewpoint. I would talk about the importance of recognizing the relationships that produce problems and the relationships that produce solutions. So I think I would pull back from our usual technical knowledge, technical language, where we would, we'd start in talking about, well, I can link your requirements to your physical architecture, and we can develop bidirectional traceability through from the requirements to the architecture and back again. So I think I would do it by leaving the technical jargon and the technical language that we're so used to in systems engineering, and talk more in terms of problem solving and systems relationships.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I've got another one from Mike. He's asking, what other markets are there for systems engineering tools and practices?
Pretty much as many as you can think of. One that I'm particularly interested in is the application of systems thinking to public policy formulation. What would happen if, when we started talking about public policy, if we did it from the perspective of system design, and we did some thinking about, okay, if I go in this direction, what are the potential consequences of that, and what what relationships are there and what feedback loops are set up and how does this all interrelate. Another area that doesn't go very far afield, that one goes pretty far afield from what we all do, but one that doesn't go very far afield is imagine if you could introduce it to procurement processes so that the procurement could come out with a high-level model of what they're looking for. And you put that out as a procurement and say, okay, bidders, tell me how you might implement what I've laid out here. And then your bid response would become a model built down a level or two below that of what the solution structure might look like. And that's not being done very widely. There are some pockets of that. Some folks call that left of spec design. And there are some folks out there thinking about that. Lots of different opportunities, process design opportunities, using it not to make things but to make processes, Lean, Six Sigma implementations. Just the sky's kind of the limit on what the market is.
Yeah, we're getting more and more calls every day from people who are coming from non-traditional markets, so there definitely are a lot of opportunities there. We do have one more question for you. This is from Caroline. She's asking, how do you tackle getting a handle on complex problems?
Well, I think the way that you tackle that is that you begin to develop it out through the relationships and talk about what are the feedback loops and pull yourself up to the systems level and take a look at it at the gross systems level, and then move yourself down into the particularities rather than charge in, grab a hold of one particularity and try to build back out. Now, it's possible to do that, but if you do that, you have to remember to build all the way back out to whatever the system boundary is that you need to consider. But the best way to begin to tackle complexity is to do it at the gross level and gradually increase your granularity.
Yeah, and that seems to speak well to our strata method, that type of approach. So thank you very much. If anybody has any other questions or comments for Zane that come up after the webinar today, please don't hesitate to shoot him an email. You can see his email address on your screen now, or you can also post your questions and comments in the forum of our community site, and I will also chat out that link to everybody. And so you're getting that right now. And I just wanted to let everybody know I will be sending an invitation out early next week to our next webinar, which is scheduled for October 14th. Our principal systems engineer, Ron Kratzky, will be presenting on test and evaluation and course. This is going to be a tool-centric webinar for everybody out there. So please keep an eye on your inbox and VITEC social media channels for the registration links. Just one last note for us today. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey is going to open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation, or to let us know what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. And that's all we have for today, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me put up one flag and do one small advertisement. If you're interested in this and want to go deeper, the Chesapeake and Cosi chapter is sponsoring a morning workshop on this Saturday at the Advanced Physics Lab, Johns Hopkins APL. I'll be giving the tutorial on Saturday morning. You can go to the Chesapeake and Cosi site to sign up, but we'd be more than happy for you to come out and be with us and talk about this in some more depth and at a more practical level.
It sounds like a great opportunity. Thank you for letting us know about that. So anybody who has any questions about that opportunity and you can't seem to track down the link, again, you can contact Zane or you can respond back to your webinar invitation and we'll get you routed to the right place. And is anything else for you today, Zane?
That's it for me. Thank you, everybody.
Sounds good. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.